What breaks first, a nation or a king? What does freedom cost when fear has ruled for generations? And why does this ancient story still feel uncomfortably close? Exodus is not just a tale about leaving Egypt. It is a confrontation between power and promise, memory and identity, judgment and mercy. The text places Israel under forced labor, in a world where survival depends on the will of the throne, and where children are born into chains before they can speak. Many details of chronology and exact political setting are debated by scholars, but the core narrative remains clear. A crushed people cry out and history begins to move. But here's the thing, Exodus does not begin with miracles. It begins with pressure, silence, and a question no empire can answer forever. How long can injustice look normal before it collapses? The story introduces Moses as an unlikely mediator, shaped by palace knowledge and wilderness exile, then pulled back into danger with a message he did not design. From there, each plague is framed not as random spectacle, but as escalating judgment against hardened resistance. Interpreters disagree on how to read the natural and supernatural dimensions of these events, yet the narrative purpose is consistent. The God of Israel is not local, not manageable, and not impressed by imperial claims. Then comes the night of Passover, where warning, blood, and urgency meet at the doorway. Families eat in haste, ready to depart, while grief and deliverance unfold in the same dark hours. This is where memory becomes ritual, and ritual becomes identity. The escape through the sea stands as one of Scripture's defining scenes, though debates continue over geography and route details. Even so, the theological claim is unmistakable. Liberation is not self-manufactured here. It is received and then remembered. Here's what most people miss. Exodus does not end at the shoreline. Freedom without formation quickly becomes chaos. At Sinai, covenant gives shape to a rescued people, binding law, worship, and communal responsibility together. Yet almost immediately, the golden calf exposes how fast fear can remake old idols in new forms. The same community that sings deliverance can drift into rebellion within days. That tension is the pulse of the whole book. Our thesis is simple. Exodus reveals that true deliverance is not only escape from oppression, but a difficult transformation into covenant faithfulness under the presence of God. In this episode, we will trace Israel's bondage in Egypt, the meaning and force of the 10 plagues, the turning point of Passover and the night of escape, and the covenant crisis at Sinai with the golden calf. If you have ever prayed for change and then feared what change would demand, Exodus will feel very personal. The God who hears the cry of the oppressed also calls the rescued into obedience, and that call is never casual. Stay with this story, and you may discover that the wilderness is not where faith dies, but where it is stripped, tested, and made honest. How does a people become enslaved slowly enough to call it normal? The opening movement of Exodus does not begin with thunder. It begins with administration, anxiety, and policy. A new Pharaoh rises in Egypt, and the text says he did not know Joseph. Whether that means personal ignorance, dynastic distance, or political rejection is debated, but the result is unmistakable. A once protected minority is now recast as a demographic threat. Numbers become fear. Fear becomes law. Law becomes labor. Labor becomes a machine that consumes bodies and names. At first, the pressure sounds almost bureaucratic. Taskmasters, quotas, storage cities often identified as Pithom and Ramses. Brick by brick, the state turns human life into economic output. If you listen closely, this is where the deeper question enters. Is oppression always dramatic at the start, or does it first appear as efficient management? The biblical narrator gives almost no romantic framing. This is heat, mud, deadlines, and exhaustion. Men are crushed in work lines. Women bear children into insecurity. Families survive day to day, while the empire writes its own story about why this is necessary. Then policy escalates from exploitation to erasure. Hebrew midwives are ordered to kill newborn boys. The story names two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and preserves their defiance. Their precise social status and scale of authority are discussed among interpreters, yet the narrative point is sharp. In a system built on fear, small acts of courage can become a line history cannot fully erase. They fear God more than Pharaoh. They refuse to do what power has normalized. Their resistance is quiet, almost hidden, but it keeps life moving when death has become official. And when the first policy fails, another order spreads wider. Male infants are to be cast into the Nile. The river that gives Egypt life becomes an instrument of terror. It is hard to miss the emotional force of this moment. Before Moses is a prophet, he is a baby under sentence. Before deliverance is a public event, it is a mother hiding a crying child. We are introduced to Moses through fragility, not strength, set in an ark of reeds among river plants, drawn out by Pharaoh's daughter. The text's legal and court details here are interpreted in different ways, but one theme stands firm. Providence in Exodus often moves through risky human decisions long before it appears as spectacle. This is where the book starts to expose our episode's central tension. Israel is physically alive, but socially chained. They are still a people, but their identity is being ground down. Can liberation mean only leaving the work camp? Or must it also heal the imagination of those who have lived under fear for generations? The narrative lets that question breathe. Moses grows with divided formation, Hebrew by birth, Egyptian by upbringing, then fugitive in Midian after killing an Egyptian overseer. His first attempt at intervention is impulsive and costly. He sees injustice and strikes, but no nation is freed. He carries zeal without commission, anger without architecture. Years pass in obscurity. Wilderness replaces court life. A shepherd's routine replaces royal possibility. Then at Horeb, often associated with Sinai, fire appears in a bush that burns without being consumed. Even here, the call is not triumphant at first. Moses hesitates, argues, resists. Who am I to go? What if they do not believe me? What name should I carry? The divine answer includes mystery and mission together. God identifies himself in language rendered as I am who I am, with translation nuances much discussed, but the command is clear. Go back, speak to Pharaoh, bring my people out. Notice what the text does and does not promise. It does not promise an easy negotiation. It predicts resistance. It prepares Moses for refusal. Liberation is announced, yet conflict is guaranteed. That matters because Exodus refuses fantasy. Even when God is acting, deliverance can begin with setbacks that feel like defeat. Moses and Aaron bring the demand. Pharaoh answers with contempt. Straw is withheld, quotas remain, and suffering intensifies. The people who hoped for relief now blame their own would-be deliverer. This is the emotional realism many modern retellings skip. The first sign of movement can look like deeper pain. So what do we learn inside the bondage narrative? We learn that oppression is not only chains on wrists, but stories in the air, habits in the body, and fear in the reflexes. We learn that courage can begin with unnamed laborers and two midwives before it reaches palaces. We learn that calling does not erase weakness. Moses stammers, questions and doubts, yet is still sent. We learn that God hears groaning not as background noise but as covenant memory in motion. And we learn the first hard truth of the whole book. Escape from Egypt is necessary, but it will never be sufficient by itself. If fear remains enthroned inside the heart, Egypt can travel with you. And that brings us to the second movement, where power and judgment collide in public. What are the plagues? warnings to a stubborn king, or dismantling of an entire worldview. The 10 plagues are often remembered as dramatic scenes, but in Exodus they function like a courtroom sequence: message, refusal, escalation, space for repentance, hardening, another sign. Moses stands before Pharaoh again and again with the same core demand: let my people go, that they may worship. Not simply leave, but leave for covenant purpose. Freedom is framed from the start as movement towards service to God, not autonomous self-definition. Interpretations of the plagues vary. Some read each plague as a direct challenge to particular Egyptian deities. Others caution that this mapping can be overstated. Many see natural phenomena intensified and timed with extraordinary precision, while others emphasize supernatural rupture beyond ordinary patterns. The careful approach is to hold what the text itself foregrounds. Egypt's king claims functional absoluteness. The God of Israel demonstrates uncontested authority over water, land, animals, weather, health, light, and life. The Nile turns to blood. Whether symbolic reddening, algal event, or miraculous transformation is disputed, yet the narrative meaning is hard to miss. The source of imperial stability is struck first. Frogs multiply beyond usefulness and become nuisance, then plague. Gnats or lice, depending on translation, and flies follow. Livestock disease damages the economy. Boils invade bodies. Hail destroys crops and trees. Locusts consume what remains. Darkness covers Egypt for 3 days, a darkness described as palpable. Then the final blow approaches with terrible gravity. Between each event, the story keeps asking a moral question. What does power do when confronted with evidence that it is not ultimate? Pharaoh oscillates. He refuses, negotiates, performs partial concessions, then retracts. This cycle is psychologically precise. Pride rarely surrenders in one moment. It bargains, it delays, it pretends cooperation while preserving control. Even the repeated language of hardening is interpreted along different lines. At points, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. At points, God is said to harden Pharaoh's heart. The interplay between human agency and divine judgment has generated centuries of debate. But whatever model one adopts, Exodus portrays judgment not as arbitrary mood, but as response to persistent, knowing resistance. Here's what most people miss. The plagues are not only about Egypt's guilt, they are also about Israel's education. A slave people has lived for generations under the aura of Egyptian permanence. The plagues unteach that permanence. They reveal that empire can bleed, tremble, and fail. They also confront a temptation that will follow Israel into the wilderness. The temptation to think visible power equals final truth. In Exodus, visible power is repeatedly exposed as temporary theater. Could Pharaoh have turned earlier? The narrative implies opportunities were present, though the exact logic of divine foreknowledge and timing remains mysterious. What is clear is that delayed obedience increases devastation. Each refusal narrows the path. Each counterfeit surrender hardens consequences. This pattern stretches beyond ancient Egypt. Individuals and societies can normalize warning signs until correction feels impossible. By the time reality forces change, the cost has multiplied. Yet even in judgment, the text distinguishes precision from chaos. Goshen, where Israelites dwell, is at times portrayed as protected from later plagues. Scholars discuss sequence and scope details, but the thematic contrast is intentional. The God of Exodus is not lashing out blindly. He discriminates, addresses, warns, and acts with moral purpose. For a channel like ours, with mystery and tone, this is where suspense deepens. The more clearly judgment is targeted, the more uncomfortable the question becomes. If this God is not manageable by kings, is he manageable by us? And still, despite escalating signs, Pharaoh keeps his grip. which leads to the night no household in Egypt will forget, and no household in Israel is commanded to forget. The transition from public plague to private doorway changes everything. Why does Exodus place a meal at the center of a national rescue? The Passover narrative is intimate, domestic, and severe. Instructions are given by household. Select a lamb. Keep it until the appointed day. Slaughter at twilight. Mark the doorposts with blood. Eat roasted flesh with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Eat in haste, belt fastened, sandals on, staff in hand. This is ritual under emergency conditions, memory formed before the event is complete. The details of chronology and calendar background are discussed in scholarship, including how this rite relates to existing pastoral practices. But in the literary frame of Exodus, the meaning is focused. Judgment is passing through the land, and God provides a marked path of mercy. The blood is not magic, it is covenant sign. It distinguishes those who trust the word given from those who remain within the ordinary assumptions of Egypt. The same night holds both deliverance and loss, songs of preparation in one quarter, cries of grief in another. We should speak carefully here, because this is one of the hardest passages for modern ears. The death of the firstborn confronts us with moral weight that cannot be handled by cliché. Different theological traditions explain this event differently, and ethical objections are real. Yet the text itself places the event within a long arc. Pharaoh's regime has already ordered Hebrew sons to die. Repeated warnings have been ignored. Judgment arrives as culmination, not surprise. Even so, Exodus does not invite gloating. It records a night of terror in which no house is untouched by consequence. At midnight, the turning point comes. Pharaoh calls for Moses and Aaron and commands departure. Not tomorrow, now. Israel leaves with urgency, carrying dough before it rises. The unleavened bread becomes edible memory. Generations later, children will ask, why this bread? Why this night? Why this story? And parents are instructed to answer, because liberation without remembrance decays into myth or pride. The command to remember is as central as the command to leave. Then the route bends toward the sea. Traditions identify this crossing in different locations, often translated as the Red Sea or Sea of Reeds, depending on Hebrew rendering. Geography debates continue, but the narrative architecture is clear. The people are trapped between water ahead and chariots behind. Panic erupts. The same mouths that celebrated release now accuse Moses. Were there no graves in Egypt? Why bring us here to die? This is the heartbeat of Exodus in miniature. Physical exit has happened, but psychological Egypt still speaks fluently through fear. Moses answers with words that have steadied generations. Stand firm. See the salvation of the Lord. The sea parts in the text's account by strong east wind and divine action, with interpretations differing on mechanism. Israel passes through. Egyptian forces pursue and are overwhelmed as waters return. Whatever one's model for the event, the theological claim is unwavering. The God who judged Pharaoh also makes an impossible path where none is visible. Then comes song. Moses and Miriam lead praise that celebrates not only rescue but reversal. Horse and rider cast into the sea. The oppressor's technology fails before the Creator's will. Yet Exodus refuses to end there, and this refusal is crucial to our thesis. If the story ended at the shoreline, liberation could be mistaken for mere escape, but the next scenes move quickly from triumph to testing. Water is bitter at Mara. Food is scarce. Complaints return. The sea miracle does not erase old reflexes overnight. So ask yourself plainly, what if the greater miracle is not crossing water, but becoming a different people after crossing? What if redemption requires a new memory, a new rhythm, a new obedience? Passover and the sea answer one kind of bondage. Sinai will expose another. The chains on the body are broken. The deeper chains in desire and trust are about to be named. Can a liberated nation survive without a covenant to shape it? At Sinai, Exodus shifts from escape narrative to formation narrative. Thunder, cloud, trumpet blast, trembling mountain. These are not decorative effects. They dramatize distance and holiness, warning that the God who rescues is also the God who commands. Israel gathers not to consume spiritual experience, but to enter binding relationship. If Egypt represented coerced service to empire, Sinai defines willing service under God. The Decalogue, often called the Ten Commandments, stands at the center of this section, with wording preserved in Exodus 20 and repeated with variations in Deuteronomy. The first words are identity before demand. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Command follows gift. Obligation follows rescue. This order matters. Obedience is not a ladder to earn deliverance. It is a response to deliverance already given. Yet covenant in Exodus includes more than 10 lines on stone. There are laws about worship, justice, property, debt, rest, and treatment of vulnerable people. Some legal specifics are hard for modern readers and interpreted differently across traditions, but the broad design is coherent. God is not forming private spirituality alone. He is forming social life. Time must change through Sabbath rhythm. Speech must change through truthfulness. Desire must change through limits. Power must change through justice. Why is this so urgent? Because freedom without structure is quickly recaptured by old idols. And idols in Exodus are not only statues, they are compressed systems of trust. What do we fear most? What do we obey fastest? What do we believe will save us when pressure rises? Sinai offers a grammar for covenant life, so that panic does not write the future. Then comes one of Scripture's most devastating reversals. While Moses remains on the mountain, delay unsettles the camp. People gather around Aaron and demand visible gods to go before them. Aaron collects gold and fashions a calf. The narrative links image-making with a festival and sacrificial language. Scholars discuss whether this represents direct replacement of Yahweh, unauthorized representation of Yahweh, or mixed worship. In any case, the covenant rupture is immediate and profound. Think about the speed of this collapse. The people have seen plagues, sea deliverance, and mountain fire, yet anxiety about uncertainty pushes them back towards something familiar and controllable. They do not ask for atheism. They ask for a manageable God. That is why the golden calf scene remains painfully contemporary. Human beings often prefer tangible reassurance over faithful waiting. We trade holy mystery for portable certainty. Moses descends, tablets in hand, to the sound of corrupted celebration. He smashes the tablets, a visible sign that covenant has been broken before it is even fully received. Judgment follows inside the camp, and the text's details are severe. Interpreters and traditions wrestle with these details and their theological implications. What cannot be softened is the warning. A rescued people can recreate bondage through worship disorder faster than they imagine. Still, Exodus does not conclude in total ruin. Intercession enters. Moses pleads for mercy, appeals to God's promises, and asks for continued presence. This intercessory role becomes central to biblical memory. Justice is not denied, but mercy is sought. Relationship is fractured, yet not abandoned. New tablets are given. The covenant is renewed. The divine name and character are proclaimed in language that holds mercy and judgment together. The Lord, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, yet not clearing guilt without consequence. The exact translation nuances vary, but the theological balance stands. This is where our central question finally sharpens. Is Exodus about one dramatic departure or about a lifelong transformation under God's presence? By now, the answer is unavoidable. The sea was decisive, but Sinai is interpretive. Without Sinai, the sea could become nostalgia. Without covenant, rescue could become chaos. Without ongoing obedience, yesterday's miracle can be tomorrow's idol factory. And this does not remain an ancient problem. Communities today can celebrate liberation moments while neglecting formation practices. Individuals can leave destructive patterns outwardly while inward loyalties remain untouched. We can denounce Pharaoh and still build calves from our own gold. We can sing about freedom and resist the disciplines that keep freedom from decaying. So where does that leave us as viewers and listeners? It leaves us in the wilderness with a searching mercy. Not cheap mercy that shrugs at idolatry, and not cold law that forgets deliverance. Exodus insists on both. God hears groaning and confronts empire. God also commands holiness and confronts the heart. The same presence that opens seas also exposes motives. That is uncomfortable, but it is also hope. If transformation is required, then transformation is possible. Maybe you feel this tension personally. You prayed for release from one kind of slavery, and now you face the harder work of becoming someone new. You expected one breakthrough to fix everything, but discovered that freedom has a daily shape. In Exodus, that discovery is not failure. It is discipleship before the word discipleship is ever spoken. The wilderness is where dependence is relearned, where memory is rehearsed, where trust is trained under pressure. And if the story has felt dark, that is because it tells the truth about power, fear, and the cost of change. But it is not dark without direction. The arc bends toward presence. Tabernacle instructions at the end of Exodus, with all their detail, are often skipped by hurried readers. Yet they answer the deepest anxiety raised at the beginning. Will the God who brought us out dwell among us as we are being remade? Exodus says yes, though not casually, not without reverence, not without obedience. So remember the path we traced. Bondage exposed the anatomy of oppression and the first fragile acts of resistance. The plagues unveiled a judgment that dismantled imperial certainty and educated a slave people to see beyond visible power. Passover and the sea turned deliverance into embodied memory and showed that impossible exits can open at the edge of collapse. Sinai and the golden calf revealed that freedom can be forfeited internally unless covenant reshapes desire, worship, and communal life. The thesis holds. Liberation is the first movement, not the finish line. God breaks external chains, then calls the freed into covenant faithfulness. When that call is ignored, old slavery returns in religious disguise. When that call is embraced, a people learns to walk in costly freedom. But one question remains, and it should follow us into every next chapter. If Egypt is behind us, what calf are we still carrying within us? That is where the story turns next. So where does Exodus leave us after all the fire, blood, water, and stone? Not with a simple ending and not with a comfortable one. It leaves us with a pattern. First, oppression is exposed, then judgment falls, then rescue comes, then formation begins, and that order is everything. The first takeaway is this. Exodus refuses to let us confuse survival with freedom. Israel survives Egypt for generations, but survival under fear is not covenant life. Bondage in Egypt shows how power can train people to accept what should never be normal. Even after the chains begin to break, fear keeps speaking in the language of scarcity, panic, and blame. That is why the story asks more than political questions. It asks what kind of people we become when pressure shapes us for too long. The second takeaway is this. Judgment in Exodus is not random spectacle, but moral confrontation. The plagues are narrated as escalating warnings against a will that will not bend. Scholars still debate how to map each plague to natural processes, specific deities, or historical layers, and the sea-crossing geography remains contested. But the central claim does not depend on solving every reconstruction. The God of Exodus is not a tribal symbol trapped in one territory. He confronts empire, exposes counterfeit permanence, and opens paths where systems insist there are none. The third takeaway is the hardest, and maybe the most personal. Passover and the sea are decisive, but they are not the finish line. Sinai reveals that liberation without covenant formation quickly collapses into a new slavery of the heart. The golden calf is the warning carved into the center of the book. A rescued people can still crave a manageable God. A people who walked through water can still bow to metal. That tension answers our main question. Exodus is not merely about getting out. It is about being remade, slowly, under a holy presence that cannot be reduced to our fear. And that is why this ancient text still feels uncomfortably close. We still live inside powers that promise security in exchange for obedience. We still mistake visible control for ultimate truth. We still want instant relief, but resist the disciplines that keep relief from decaying. Exodus does not mock that weakness. It names it, judges it, and then calls people forward anyway. If you listen to this story as history alone, you heard a nation's deliverance. If you listened as mirror, you heard a diagnosis. Where have we accepted Egypt as normal? Where have we celebrated rescue but neglected formation? Where have we asked for freedom while keeping a private altar to fear? These are not abstract questions. They are the fault lines of every generation. There is also a quiet consolation here. Moses is not fearless. Israel is not consistently faithful. The wilderness is not neat. Yet the narrative does not end in abandonment. Covenant is broken and renewed. Judgment is real and mercy is real. Presence is not withdrawn forever. Even with unresolved historical details around chronology and route timing, the theological movement remains coherent. The God who hears groaning also teaches, corrects, and dwells among a people still learning how to be free. So hold the thesis one more time. Liberation is the first movement, not the finish line. External chains can be shattered in a night. Internal chains are usually broken in a long obedience. Exodus calls that long obedience covenant, memory, worship, and justice lived in community. Not dramatic every day, but faithful over time. If this episode stayed with you, carry one question into the comments. What is harder in your life right now? Leaving Egypt, or refusing to rebuild it? And as we move to the next chapter, keep your eyes on the wilderness, because the place that looks empty may be where God tests whether freedom can survive without idols. Before you go, based on what we uncovered today, answer this in the comments. Do you think freedom in Exodus is escape or obedience after deliverance? And as always, God bless you.